Hi guys, my name is Ivo and I'm from mytestedasp.net. It's time for part 4 of my how to write clean and testable code series, and in this video we're going to learn how to assert private methods. So let me explore what kind of options we have regarding this problem by going to Visual Studio and show you an example. If you remember correctly from my previous videos, we had a block system which is written with bad practices in mind and it's not very testable. So what we're doing in this video series is refactoring it and making it more testable in order for you to learn how to write solid and clean code. If you're new around here, make sure you hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell because I'm uploading advanced C# lessons every week, at least 2 videos. Okay, now let's see a private method. The example I have here is in this image service class. Essentially, I am having a private static calculate optimal size method, which its sole purpose is to validate the original image size and what will be the best resized calculation. So one of the logic here is that the minimum image size is 100 pixels in width and height. And if we pass the method less than 100 pixels, it will not allow us to do that, and it will convert our values to exactly 100 pixels. So let's say that we want to assert this method. We want to validate whether this logic is correct, the one with the 100 pixels. Okay, so I'm going to block test. I'm going to create a new folder called services because that's essentially a part of my services project and I would like to separate it from the controllers, fakes and so on. I'm going to create an image service test and I'm going to use xUnit. Cool. I'm going to use it started failing because essentially this my namespaces started failing because I added services here and Visual Studio went crazy. So let's fix that very fast. Looks okay. And done. Okay, cool. We fixed the using issue. So if you remember, I'm using arrange act assert. So let's start with that. I'm going to add a new test which says calculate optimal size public void a fact method to mark it as an unit test, and calculate optimal size should return minimum size when size is less than the allowed minimum. Something like that. Okay, first let's arrange. We're going to need our image service. Image service, like this. Then I'm going to need to call calculate optimal size. And here comes the first problem. Actually, the first problem is that this method is static. If you remember from my previous video, static methods are not testable, so for best clean and testable code, we should avoid them. So I'm going to remove this code from being static. I'm going to convert it to be an instance method, and I'm going to rebuild to see whether everything works correctly. It should be, because I am essentially calling this method only from the public one here. Okay, we cannot call the private method here because essentially it's a private method. And in the best case scenario, it should remain private. The first option we need to consider is whether to expose that method and make it public. For example, like this. If we truly believe that this method should be private, we should not make it public. So let's say that converting it to public method is not an option. So we need to remain it hidden. In some situations, you may convert it to public and it will be completely fine. So it depends on your design, but in our case, we don't want to make it public. We don't want it to be exposed to our controller classes. That's the whole idea here. Because essentially the controller class should not know how to calculate optimal size. Okay, so that's not an option. The second option is using reflection. But with using reflection, our code becomes a little bit uglier because we need to say something like type of image service get method name get method calculate image size, optimal size, and then invoke it, and so on and so on. It becomes a little bit of I don't like this code. It's not very pretty, and it's essentially like a mini hack. If you still want to use reflection, you may use a technique I showed earlier on my channel. That's how to beautify ugly C# reflection code. If we go to my channel, which is my tested ASP.NET TV, and go back to one of my first videos, I have a tutorial on beautifying ugly C# reflection code by using the dynamic type. Essentially, that code will allow us to do something like this. Exposed, call exposed, and then call the private method directly. That's okay. If you want to go that route, I'm going to leave a link in the description down below this video, and I'm going to show you how to do it there. But let's consider that we don't want to use reflection and dynamic types at all. We want to follow best practices. And if you want to follow best practices without making the private method uh, public, we have two options. The first option is to assert the private method through the public interface of the class. So call a public method so that you validate the private method is working correctly. That's a valuable option. You should consider it every time you want to assert a private method. So essentially, in my case, I would need to write image service dot update image and provide such parameters so that I will validate the minimum size logic here. That's okay, but in some situations like this one, we would need to write quite a lot of mocking code and faking code because this public method here, update image, has a web client, has an image from an external library, and has a file. We need to mock the world just to validate this private method, which essentially is not that important. So our unit test will have quite a lot of boilerplate code. So in this situation, writing testing the public method will be a little bit of too much in order to validate such a small logic here. In my future videos in this series, I'm going to show you how to assert the web client, the image, and the file, but that's not the main topic here, so I'm going to skip that. So let's recap. We can make the method public if we want. That's a good option. If the design is allowing us to do that, we may use reflection. That's also an OK option, but even better is to use an exposed object with the dynamic type. And we have an option to validate the private class by using the public interface, the private method by using the public interface of the class. And the last option, which is considered one of the best practices, is by using internal. But before I show you this technique, I'm going to tell you where you can find this source code I'm using as an example. What you need to do is to go to my GitHub profile, which is Ivailo Kenov, and in my GitHub profile, you may click repositories, write down TV here, and this is essentially the repository I'm using for my YouTube channel. All the source code and all the examples from my video lessons are here. It's linked here. Every video and every source code is added here. So if you want to play with it, you may clone it or just download it. I will be extremely thankful if you give a star. And if you want, you can watch this project, because usually I upload a video link and the source code before I make the lesson public on YouTube. So essentially you are going to see the lesson a little bit earlier, maybe 1 or 2 days. I'm going to use the moment to thank my sponsors. That's Bellatrix, ReSharper and JetBrains, Softuni, Smart IT, NovoHire, and 1Bit Software. Guys, you're truly awesome. Thank you for supporting my work. You motivate me to continue providing free lessons to the people on YouTube and to continue developing my open source projects. Thank you, guys. You completely rock. Let's now continue to Visual Studio and let's use the internals to validate this method. So what we need to do is not make the method public, but mark it as internal. This way, this method will not be visible to all the other projects in our system, so the controller layer won't be able to call the calculate optimal size method. Then, for having to explain to our teammates why this method is actually internal, we may add a comment internal for unit testing or internal for testing purposes. You may find this technique strange, but believe me, it's one of the best practices which Microsoft suggests and which Microsoft actually follows. If you examine the Entity Framework core source code or the ASP.NET core source code, you will see that they validate their private and not exposed methods by marking them internal. Okay, but that's not enough. we still cannot call internal methods from our test project because essentially internals make the method visible only to block services. Okay, but we have an option to say something like this. We can add an assembly attribute which is called internals visible to. Internals visible to attribute allows me to say which projects can see the internal methods and internal classes of block services. So by adding this assembly attribute, I can call the internal methods here. And now I can say, okay, I want to resize an image to 50 pixels width and 50 pixels height, while the original width was 200 and the original height was 200. I'm going to get the result. Let's destruct it. And let's assert it. Just to be clear, this is not the best way to mark an assembly as internals visible to, but give me a minute and I'm going to show you how to do it in a more clean way. Okay, we have width and height, and what we need to do now is we need to assert that actually, let me just add some consts here. Const minimum size is 100 pixels. Extracting constants is always a best practice. So whenever you find yourself that you're repeating values, make sure you extract them. It makes the code cleaner. Then I'm going to say it like that. And so the original size is going to be put here, the resize size here. I'm going to put that on the line below because it gets lengthy. And now I'm going to validate that I'm expecting the width to be the minimum size and the height to be the minimum size too. So let's run that test. Let's validate that it passes. And I'm going to show you how to better implement the internals visible to attribute. The method passes. So essentially we validated our private method by marking it as internal. I know it looks strange, but let me show you an example from Microsoft. Let's open a Microsoft repository, the ASP.NET Core one. This is the file which I want to show you. It doesn't matter what it does, it's part of the writing assembly, but Microsoft essentially mark some of the private fields. You can see that this is a field, and they mark them as internal for testing. They also have private methods which they also delegate as they mark as internal and comment above them to make sure that people know why these methods are not private but are internal. So this is one of the best practices you can use if you want to assert non-public members of a class. The only problem here is that this assembly attribute, it's a bit of misplaced here. It works, but I don't like it to be put on some service class, because essentially that's an assembly-wide attribute. This attribute is specified on the whole assembly. Its place is not exactly here. So where we can put it? We can put it in the CS_proc file. So essentially we can put the assembly attribute here. There's a syntax for that. It's not the most beautiful syntax, but it will work, and it will hide that we are exposing internal members to another project from the code. It will be where it belongs, in the project file. So let me write that. You need to write item group, then you need to add assembly attribute, then include system runtime.compiler services, essentially the namespace of the attribute, dot internals visible to attribute. That's what we need to do here. And then we need to provide the first constructor parameter, which is done like this. And we need to provide the assembly we're going to expose our internals to. I'm going to save the project, essentially a new item group, assembly attribute, include the namespace and the attribute system runtime compiler services, internals visible to attribute, and provide the first parameter of the constructor, which is block.test in my example. Let's rebuild the solution and let's see whether it still works. Just to make it clear, you may search on Google. You don't need to remember this code. You can just search on Google and type something like internals visible to CS_proc, and you will see this code example, and you may copy it from there. Okay, so after writing this, now I can still call the calculate optimal size, because my assembly has the internals visible to attribute, and now I validated that my non-public logic is working correctly. That's it, guys. I hope you liked this video. Stay tuned for the next one. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. If you were having fun as much as I did, hit the like button and leave a comment below saying everything you like about clean code, testing code, if you know any other best practices, and so on and so on. I will be extremely thankful. And last, if you want to support my projects or this channel, you may do it by Patreon or Open Collective. You may already know that I'm creating open source projects, which I'm actually developing in my free time. They are related to the ASP.NET Core framework and are providing a very easy and fluent assertion API, which allows you to write very simple tests in a matter of seconds. These projects grew quite big, so I would be very thankful if you decide to support the channel or the projects. You may do it through Patreon, Open Collective, PayPal, or Buy Me a Coffee. Some people already did, so I'm extremely thankful. Okay, guys, have fun and see you in the next video.